McEntee. Don is a retired civil engineer from the Dublin Corporation. He was involved, he had a big involvement in the upgrading of the spillways to two of the reservoirs in Bourne Arena. And he's also co-written a book about the original design of the reservoir, which was published in 2016 with a colleague of his, Michael Corcoran. Don's talk is going to be very interesting to the vast majority of you, but there are few of us like myself who are blowing up the Stillorgan, so hopefully we're going to learn something as well. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Don.
When I was 6 years old, I moved to Stillorgan. We lived in Lindenlee. At the time I had an older brother, Michael, and a younger sister, Zita, and then Colette was born in 1952, Joe in 1964, and Fergus in 1956. So that was 6 of us there. In the 1950s, some people will remember things were very, very difficult. My father had a temporary job at the time in the early 50s. And in 1953, we were preparing to go to New Zealand as a family. In those days, some of you may remember, you could get from here to New Zealand for £10. It was a cheap run in those days and a one-way ticket. But luckily for me, I suppose that I'm here now, in 1953 got a permanent job at Dublin Corporation. As the family outgrew the house, we moved from here to Clontarf in 1958. So what I'm going to tell you now are my recollections of the last 70 years ago, for the 8 years I was in Stillorgan. Some of you may say what I'm telling you is right or wrong, but one's recollections are only what you can actually remember, so you'll have to bear with me then. At the time, Stillorgan was a very small village. There was the main road which went from Dublin to Bray, and the section from Donnybrook to Stillorgan was known as the Stillorgan Road. And then we had the Kilmacud Road joining in the centre of the village, as you probably all know that now. Coming into the village, there was a walled estate, Kilmacud, on the left-hand side.
On the right-hand side, there was a number of new houses leading to a recess of new shops, which included Bowman's. Bowman's sold newspapers, comics, sweets, minerals and tobacco. It was a busy shop on Sundays, as people called after Mass for their Sunday papers. We got our Beano and Dandy comics there.
And the next one we had then was the library and a hall. Right beside that was the butcher shop.
The next shop was Lloyd's. Lloyd's at that time consisted of 4 shops. The first shop sold groceries. The second shop was a barber shop. The third sold bicycles and other odds and ends, and the fourth was a gardening shop. Overhead there was a second-hand furniture place and clothing. At the back of Lloyd's they had a big market garden with a number of glass houses.
And then on the corner we had Farrell's, which was a local grocery shop. I think there may have been 1 or 2 other little places in between, but they were of no concern to me, so I don't remember them. On the far side of the road from Farrell's there was the Boland's pub, which is still there today. And then coming down the hill, these are the shops. They're shops now, but in those days they were little cottages, 2 or 3 room cottages, and a lot of people living in them. And there was, at the bottom of the hill, there was a pub, Cullen's, and there was also Simmons, which was an electrical outlet. And then we had this old road here too. That was a bypass built in about the 1930s there. We called it the bypass. The old road then was known as the Old Bray Road. I lived in Lindenlee here, which is at the view of it. That's a view taken from Lindenlee before there was any houses built. You can see the backs of the houses in the village. And there was the house before we moved in. Now going west we had the Kilmacud Road. There was McCann's, the local coal merchants were in here. Beaufield Park had been built in the 40s by the county council. There was this stream, which is Kilmacud stream, flowed parallel to the road. And when I was young, there was a field back here. This was one of our playgrounds, and we used to spend a lot of time in the river. Coming up further on, then we have the school. There was Lower Kilmacud Road, Upper Kilmacud Road, and at that time South Avenue had been built. We also have the church, and the presbytery was beside it. And just a little story about the church. In 1950 there was only a small population. By 1952, the population had grown so much that a lot of the people that went to Mass, especially the 11:30 Mass on Sunday, stood outside the door and heard nothing. Now this is an aerial view of the village. In 1962 this one was taken. You can see that the shopping centre was started just here. There's Glenalban, that's where we are now at the moment. There was Linden Lee. You can see the bypass there. And this section of land was left for the bypass, which we know it as the bypass. In the 1950s we got all our basic food from Farrell's. They sold sugar, butter, flour, bacon, cooked ham, etc. And most of these were all loose, weighed out and put into bags. On a Thursday, a person came around from the shop and took the order, and on Saturday it was delivered. At the end of the month, one settled up their account with the grocer. Milk was delivered daily, and we had bread vans used to come around. We used to have a person selling vegetables. There was a number of laundries as well. We had Imco and Swastika were very common in this area here. So you got all your clothes picked up, laundered and brought back. Twice a year we got a delivery of coal. Each house had a coal house at the back, and it used to hold 1 ton of coal. And as you can see there with the chap unloading here, each of those bags weighed 1¼ hundredweight. There was only 16 to a ton. Under health and safety now, that would be totally bad. But one of the instructions that we had as kids when coal was being delivered, our mother said, stand outside the coal house, and every time a coal bag is dropped in, count the bags while the guy is there. Because if you didn't count them very carefully, they would always slip in one, so you'd always end up with less coal than you were actually paying for. So that was one of the jobs that we were always instructed to do. Now there's Linden Lee. At the top of the road was Glenalban, the house which we're in at the present time. And there was this large field. There was a large copse of trees here, and right in front of the house there was a big walnut tree. The main avenue from the Kilmacud Road up to the house. In 1950 that was disused, it was never used at all. And the people, Wilkinsons, who used to live in the main house, they used to use this back entrance into the house. The Wilkinsons were in the business of cattle trade, and they used to, I think, they used to auction and send cattle over to England. North Circular Road was their place where they worked. Now, I'm just diverging here. The talk isn't exactly given in certain orders here, but I'm just mentioning these three ladies here, the McGrortys, because they lived right next door to us. And they had come from Killigordon in Donegal to live in Dublin. And Clem, the one on the left, she was the eldest of the family and the lady in the family. Kit, on the right, she was a retired school teacher. And Lily, she did the cooking and the housework. It was an open house, and Lily, she cycled everywhere, and she taught all the children on the road how to cycle. Kit was a great bridge player, and she encouraged all the children to play cards. She had special packs of cards for us children to play with. The house was full of interesting items that they had taken from their big house in Killigordon. The one item we all loved was that a huge gong, about this size, in the hall. And when we went in, we were allowed to give it a bang. When we went in there, they'd have these little tiny glasses, very colourful, and we would always give them a little glass of lemonade. But the children were encouraged to go in there at all times. It was like an open house. And everybody on the road loved them, and they loved everybody. I started school in 1950, St. Lawrence's School. At that time, there was 2 teachers. There was Mr. Brennan and Mrs. Dowdall. Mr. Brennan became headmaster in 1950, so we arrived in the school at the same time. And then as the numbers started growing very rapidly, the following year there was a Mrs. O'Connell came along, and she took first and second class, and there was a Mr. Byrne who also took, I think it was 3rd class. The classroom at that stage was down in the old library in I attended the 3rd class in the library. As the numbers were still growing, there was a Mr. Brosnan came in when I was in 4th class, and as there was no room left in the village, the classroom was held in the loft of Mount Merrion House, which was the old hay barn there, and we used to have to go up the steps to it, and you can imagine it was quite a cold place. For 5th class then I came back to St. Lawrence's with Mr. Brennan. But as I was a late starter, didn't start till I was 6 years of age, I left after 5th class and went to CUS in Leeson Street for secondary school. I just learned there yesterday from Mr. Brennan's son I was talking to, Ian. In 1961 there was 11 teachers in the school, and their schools were dotted all around the place before the main school was built. I'm not sure when the main school was built, but you can see the huge expansion. And there was other primary schools that opened up at the same time. So this whole area really expanded in the 1950s. My brother and myself, we walked to school across the fields. We got 2 weeks at Christmas, a week and a half at Easter, and 2 months course in summer. When it snowed, the school was open. The school never closed. So all children were expected to go to school whether there was snow or not on the ground. The toilets were outdoors. You can just see it here. That's the toilet block there. Well, meant to mention there's Mr. Brennan sitting in front of a blackboard. And the school actually was built in 1931. It was right around the school there was a very high railings. And as you can see here, there was Kilmacud stream ran beside the school. And one of the things that we loved doing at lunchtime was we used to throw little crusts of bread into the river, and you'd have maybe 3 or 4 or half a dozen rats swimming to get there as quickly as they could. And that was lunchtime entertainment for us. When I was down in the school in the village, and when I was in St. Lawrence's here, I was given the job with 1 or 2 other people lighting the fires every morning. That was my job, to get the sticks and put the coal in and make sure there was coal there. And of course, as you can imagine, there was one little fire at the very top where the schoolmaster used to sit with his backside to it. And it was never very warm, the classrooms, that's all I can tell you. It's amazing what you can learn. One day, there was no kindling sticks available when it was Mr. Byrne, you see. So I said to him, God, we can't light the fire this morning. And he says, no problem, no problem. Give us the sheets of paper. So he got the newspaper, he rolled it real tight and made it into a knot, another piece, and about 6 or 8 pieces of paper, and they were all tied together, put in coal on top of it, lit it, and it lit the fire. So you learn little tricks along the way. Another job I had when I was up at school in Mount Merrion was I got the job as a messenger between the loft in Mount Merrion and the main school down in the Kilmacud Road. And of course that was great because, see, once you were out cycling between these places, you didn't have to bother with lessons, you know. And as you can imagine, there was no phones in those days, so it was almost like the Pony Express, only it was a bicycle express. For First Holy Communion, it was very simple in those days. We had short pants, as you can see. We never got into the long trousers until we were going to secondary school, which was the rite of passage to jump into your long trousers. But we just had white shirts, and the school provided us with sash. So there was no problems with what one was going to wear, and there was very little expense involved in it. And the same actually for the confirmation. At that time, the parish church was up in the big house of Novemver. The basement was actually the church, which was a very, very small one, even smaller than Kilmacud. And when the confirmations were held, there was no room for any of the parents to go in there. There was just enough room for the children. And at that stage, 4th, 5th and 6th class made confirmation together. So that was the way confirmation was. There was, that photograph there shows two schools. The ones in White End was I'm in there somewhere. That was St. Lawrence. Now St. Lawrence's was noted for Gaelic football and hurling. They were great at playing sports there. From 1950 to 52 we were playing in the fields which were up the road on the Kilmacud Road. Then we moved further down to the village where Allen Park is, and then eventually up at Priory. There was fields in beyond Priory. But when we were holding football matches, they were played in Herbert Park. And we used to cycle down to Herbert Park. It was very rough in those days. You tugged out the side of the field. There was no comforts at all. Oh, yeah. In 1953, the school won the Miller Shield for football, and we beat Clontarf in the finals, and they were played in Croke Park. And as you can imagine, the whole school and more turned up to watch the match. And that evening there was great celebrations, and we all got a chance to drink lemonade out of the big cup. In 1956, they won the Claymore Cup, beating Killester in football, and the Harry Conlon Cup, beating Dalkey in hurling. And a few other years they were beaten in the finals. So it was the tradition of hurling and football was very, very strong in the school, fostered by the teachers. 1955-56, every Saturday morning we used to go into Tara Street baths, and we were all taught to swim there. And at that stage you tugged out at the side of the baths. There was a little narrow pathway, and then there was little alcoves. We used to go there for an hour swimming, and we were all taught how to swim. Now the school had a great reputation for tutoring its pupils for scholarships, and each year there would be a little item in the paper about Kilmacud School getting 3 or 4 or maybe 6 scholarships. This was due to Mr. Brennan. He used to take a 7th class of the brighter pupils, and he used to tutor them for a scholarship. The reason was that in those days, if your parents didn't have money, you didn't go to secondary school, and the only chance to go to secondary school was getting one of these scholarships. Mr. Brennan was very diligent in trying to get people to win these scholarships. Another item that he did, there was a lot of people who weren't bright, I suppose is the easiest way to describe it, and the chances of going anywhere in a secondary school were 0. And a lot of these lads would end up maybe shops and that sort of thing, handling money. So he used to take them up to his house in the evening, and he was tutoring them in the real ways of the world. In other words, if a customer came in and handed you a 10-shilling note, and the goods came to, say, 3 shillings and 8 pence, what do? You can't start going and say 3 shillings and 8 pence from 10 shillings, this, that and the other. But it was very simple. What you did was, you had your change there, so you put, a penny was 3 and 9, then you put 3pence, that was 4 shillings, then you put a shilling in there, that was 5 shillings, and then you put 2 half-crowns, that made up 10 shillings, and there was the change, no mistake. There was little things like that which he tutored people who had no hope of going on for further education. Now we'll come on to the area of the games we played. Marbles in about April or May. Suddenly the shops would have them. So we were all playing marbles, and there was large marbles, small marbles, but the most sought after and there was only a few lads actually had these, were steelies. And the steely was actually a very large ball bearing, but you had to be in the know where to get one of those steelies. There was various games there where you put a circle on the ground, you throw up marbles, or in the school we were lucky, there was clay, there was no covering in the schoolyard, so you were able to dig a hole, and the idea was to throw marbles up, and whoever was nearest the hole got all the marbles, threw them up, and any of them fell in the hole, you kept them, and then the next person stuck them until they were all used up. Even Mr. Brennan, he used to have his own little package of things, and he took part in these games, but he wasn't shown any favours, I'll tell you that much. There was another one where, follow me up, where two people, one would throw a marble, and then the next person, and then when you hit that marble, you claimed it as your own. There was another game called pitch and toss, where with coins you threw them up to a wall or a mark on the ground. Outdoor games then was, during the summer, rounders was very popular, because all kids of all ages, didn't matter what they were, boys or girls could take part in it. And we usually used a cricket bat or a tennis racket for rounders. There was two teams, and I think the rules were very, very loosely based on proper game of rounders. Hide and seek was another one, and Relivio was another game which we used to play. Girls were very, very good into this skipping. There was all sorts of skipping rhymes. They used to skip with a single rope, double rope. The boys didn't really get too involved. The odd time we might get involved when there was a group like that. Generally, it was girls. The other thing that they were all, you might remember, they were great at using two balls, tossing them up to the wall, and they had many, many rhymes to go with them. The other thing was hopscotch here was very, very popular. Very easy to do, a bit of a chalk, and you had a way of marking the ground. Another ball game which was very popular then was Queenie I.O., who has the ball. I don't know if any of you remember that one at all. Again, that was great because kids of any age could take part on it, and many hours were spent playing that game. During the summer and the winter, card games were very, very popular. As I mentioned earlier on, Kate McGroarty, she encouraged everyone to play cards. One of the very popular ones in our household was Newmarket. I don't know if any of you know that. It's a horse racing game where you have 4 cards in the centre, and you put money on each of the cards, and then there's a way dealing them out that there's a spare hand, and you have to change colours and that. But it was a gambling game, and all the kids from about 3 or 4 years up to grannies could play it together, and always great arguments. But as to you think if somebody had a special card with a horse there, and you tried to make sure they didn't get a chance to play it. Other games were Old Maid, Go Fish. Rummy was a very popular one. Cheat, of course, everyone was trying to cheat, and Pontoon. As we came into September and the winter time, board games became very popular. One of the first ones we played a lot was Monopoly, and we all knew that the Old Kent Road was the worst place you could get a house, and Park Lane was the best place. And I tell you, no one actually liked going to jail, except when there was big hotels around the place, and then you'd love going in there because you missed 3 rounds. We knew 4 stations in London and some of the bigger roads in London from playing Monopoly. But the one I think which grabbed us the most was Risk. The original game of Risk. Object at that time was 4, 5, 6 players, was to get domination of the world. And some days that game would go on for maybe 2 days until someone won. Nowadays they've made it very easy by giving someone a target to get a certain continent or a certain number of cards. But Risk was a very, very big one in Lindonley where we were. Cluedo was a nice one because games lasted about a half an hour. Another one we didn't play too much was Totopoly. In 1952, my brother and myself, we got a Hornby set. And as we were living in the bungalows, there was a huge attic there. So we floored out part of it. I don't know, there was some building, of course, was going on, so getting bits and pieces of timber was no problem. And And we set up a whole circuit in the attic for trains going around. And we also then had an item called Baco. And Baco was one where you had little tiny pieces of metal here, and then you had these little bricks that went in. So you could make any size, shape of houses or items along a railway station. And we spent hours building these things. And there you can see a sort of photograph of what you could do a house. Very realistic. In the 1950s, go-kart racing was very, very big in the States. They call it boxcar there, we call it go-kart. And you get these lovely American comics coming in. You see these beautiful, like automobiles and highly painted. Well, of course, we hadn't got the wherewithal for that, so we made our own ones. As you can see here, that was the one that was taken in our back garden in Lee. Oh, the way they were made was very, very simple. Like 4 wheels, a bit of a box or something here, and then a bit of a string for the wheels at the front. At the time, there was great competition between people in the surrounding districts. On the hill here in Stillorgan, going from Kilmacud Road down to the river, we used to have many competitions as to who would go the fastest. Of course, that all ended up in 1953 when the cinema was built. But there was great rivalry in those days as to who would win it. In the 1950s, I and all my other friends cycled everywhere. I learned to cycle when I was 7 years of age. I was never off the bike. One of the places that we used to love going cycling was what we called, we didn't know what it was just a mound in those days with a hole in the middle of it. And we loved cycling up and then coming down as fast as we could. Also, we discovered that at this end here there was a door. You could actually slide underneath the door. And at that stage, there was the builder, I think he was building these houses in this vicinity here. He stored a lot of timber there. So we went in, a group of us of 6, 7, 8 year old, we went in and we built platforms which were underneath this roof. That was our headquarters for 2 years. But it was only a few months ago when we went on a walking tour that I discovered that it's called the Grotto, and part of the Allen family estate. You can see here all these little alcoves that were for statues or whatever, and obviously the hole in the middle here was so that there was 2 passageways. The light could get in so you could actually see. Another item there which I discovered, we knew about it when we were going in there, there was steps down in the grotto to an underground passageway. We always speculated that this went up to Priory, that there was from Stillorgan up there, so this was a way to get into Priory, which we assumed there'd be priests or there'd been at some previous stage there. I did learn when we were on our tour there a few months ago that our assumptions were totally incorrect. The passageway is still there, but it used to go to Brewery Road. Why it was there or what it was for, I have no idea. But it's quite an old passageway. And it's still there. The steps are still inside in that grotto. There was a timber frame over it so people wouldn't fall down. A little item here about bikes. We used to put the bikes everywhere. They were just literally dumped. Once I remember a bike was stolen, so we got in touch with the police. And every bike in those days, and they probably still do, had a number on it just underneath the saddle. So we gave the number to the policeman, and about 3 days later he delivered the bike back to us. Which you wouldn't get nowadays. One of our favourite pastimes during the summer was going down to Sea Point. Literally, the bikes were actually dumped like that down at Sea Point there, beside where the tower is here. We would go off in the morning, spend the day down there with sandwiches and that. There was, in the Martello Tower at that stage, there was a shop there, and my memory is they sold potato crisps without any flavouring, because potato hadn't arrived at that stage. And you got a little twist of salt, and you took it out. Beside the railway line there, and there was only a little tiny fence, we used to love going in with a halfpenny, putting it on the track. And then when the train would come along, it would flatten it, and if you were lucky, it would get to the size roughly of a penny. There was a little shop right beside the railway there, and the woman in that, every time you went in to buy maybe an ice cream, that she would scrutinise the coin to make sure she wasn't being bidden. I can imagine people going on to the dart line now and putting a penny in. It just couldn't happen. We'd go off in the morning. My mother never seemed to worry until we arrived home in the evening. That's the way it was. Another pastime was fishing. My father was always very keen on fishing. When he got his first car in 1954, maybe it was 55, we used to go off fishing about twice a week. Probably in the evening down to Dunleary, and then sometimes out to Greystones. In Dunleary you could get plaice, gurnard, mackerel, pollock. In Greystones we used to catch a lot of codling. Sometimes we get so much codling, they were about 2 pounds in weight, you couldn't carry them all home. There was one day I was fishing in Greystones and I pulled in a little tiny fish, about 3 inches long. I remember it had a big dorsal fin on it, very sharp, and it touched off my arm, and within about 2 or 3 minutes it had doubled in size. And of course I screamed and was taken off. I think I was taken to the doctor. But I discovered afterwards called a weasel fish, a little nasty little one which was in the sea. In 1955 and 1956, we went on holidays to Achill Island for the month of July. And in those days there, they used to catch the salmon in the sea. There was a place called Ken Bay, which was an enclosed bay. One of the fishermen would go up onto the bank with a pair of Polaroid glasses, and you could actually see the fish swimming around the bay. In the curragh, they used to put a net out at right angles, and then when the chap up on the hill would indicate that the fish were coming, they would close that over. When the fish hit the net, they always turned left for some unknown reason, and then the curragh then brought the rest of the net into the strand, and then we all then went and pulled it in, and they would, get 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 salmon at a time. Now, one of the things that we're always short of was people for hauling in the net. This is one of the times. My brother and myself, we used to go on the curragh from Duach right round the headland with the fishermen and spend the day there. And about every 2 days, he used to give us a salmon. We were maybe sick of salmon, but we also had a cat there. And the cat then refused to eat salmon. This is a game which a lot of people might remember, conkers. You'd have 2 conkers on a string, and the idea was that one would bash off the other, and then this would be number 1. If we beat another one, number 2, number 3, and so on, until eventually it broke. We spent many hours playing conkers. The only thing is sometimes there would be quite a cute little fella and he would put one of these away the previous year and store it. And that was rock hard, and there was no way you would ever beat it. There was another rule which we used to have in playing conkers, was stampies. And of course if the string broke, which was quite frequent, the idea was you'd run over as quickly as possible to stamp on it. So that was the only way, probably with these hard conkers, that you could win. There's another interesting little story. That there is a walnut tree. It was the tree in front of Glenalton House was similar to that, very, very large. About the end of September, there was a large number of lads in class with me in that. We would go up there with large lumps of timber and we'd be throwing it up there to knock the walnuts off. That's what a walnut looks like. There's a skin around it and the walnut is actually inside it. Now, that skin was quite interesting because when you were peeling the skin off the walnuts, you got this dye, a sort of a brown dye on your hands. And there was no way to wash it off. It'd be there for weeks and weeks and weeks. We also, at the same time, had a lot of those lads, like 7, 8, 9 years of age, they were all smoking woodbine. And of course the woodbine had no filters or anything in those days. Teacher in school, they were giving out like hell about smoking. And the beauty is that when the walnut season was in, there was no one could tell whether you were smoking. Just as an aside, we had the field in front of it in Alban as our playground. We were never ever run off it by the owners of the house here. Even when we were the walnuts, never came near us. So we had the free range here. And now every winter, as far as I can remember, in January and February, we'd always have 2 weeks of snow, maybe a bit more. When the first snowflakes were coming, you used to see these black clouds from the east. We would all head down towards the hill in Stillorgan, and we'd be wondering, when would the first buses and cars start sliding back? We used to make snowmen, of course, there was always competition who could make the best snowman. And snowball fights, of course, were the order of the day. In Linton Lead, because of the slope down, we were able to go out with buckets of water and throw them on the footpath. Now, generally speaking, January and February and December, it used to freeze every night. So the idea was you'd put this water down, and then with the boots then you'd slide a little bit, and then you'd slide a bit further. And you'd get to the stage where you could slide about 20 feet. And then we would have a very kind neighbour that would come out with ashes and throw it on us. So what did we do? We came out with another bucket of water, and we put over that. I suppose it wasn't very nice for some of the people who were nimble of foot, but that was the way it was. Of course, with those slides, if you had a little bit of snow on them, they were deadly. In the early part of the 1950s, Michael and myself, we used to go up to Monaghan, to my grandparents' farm, in Easter and summer holidays. In those days, my father and mother would bring into Amiens Street Station, put us on the train, and we were on our own then. We went to Dundalk. We were on strict instructions when you get off the train in Dundalk, make sure it didn't go on to Newry. And then you went over the railway line and onto another platform, and then we took the train from there to Ballybay. When they arrived at Ballybay, an aunt would meet us in a hackney car and bring us out to the farm. We actually loved being on the farm. There was able to drive tractors, making hay and all that sort of thing. But the other thing was the farm had 2 lakes on it. This was a small one, and then a very large one down here. The lakes were teeming with fish, and we had our own fishing rods, which were basically cut from a branch of a tree long, about 10 or 12 foot long. We were always fishing off the lake there. We used to catch perch and roach, looking for eggs and that sort of thing, the normal life on a farm. Between 1950 and 1953 or 54, around that period there, the great delight was at a party was to have a film show. Mr. Carlyle, that lived across the road of us, had this 16mm sound projector. And we used to go into a shop in Abbey Street, where it was actually a warehouse, and they used to have hundreds of films in there. We'd choose 1 or 2 films. Each reel lasted about 10 minutes, and the film probably was 3 reels. We would have at least 2 of them in the evening. There was great fun for very young children. We would have probably a cowboy film and some other one. That was our delight at the parties. When the films were being loaded, there was always the white light coming, and the idea was who could make the best shapes. In the 1950s, televisions were few and far between. One of our neighbours had a very tall area, black and white television, and they got the signal from the Home Ross station in Wales. The signal was very, very weak, and mostly you could only see snow. This field then, which was behind our houses here, we saw these big machines coming in 1953, and they cleared the field, and lo and behold, we were delighted when they built the Ormond Cinema. We could get in for, I think it was 9 pence was the charge in there. Pardon? They didn't have a balcony, but they had the upper one, yeah, the higher level. There was a main feature and a B film. And, well, on Saturdays there was usually the B film was a cowboy film. And there was always a short film, about 5 minutes. These were shown, Saturday these were shown on, when film ended there was always a cliffhanger, someone was going to go over a cliff or they were going to this. So if you wanted to find out what happened, you had to come the following week, you know. So of course on a Sunday they showed different films, they were sort of repeats, because they'd always fill the cinema on a Sunday and people had to buy the tickets beforehand, and then you had ticket touts outside selling the tickets. Maybe not so much out in Stillorgan here, but I know in town that happened. We had an organisation in Linden Lea and we called it the Linden Lea Broadcasting Union. And there was 4 of us, Charlie Byrne, Des Arrigo, Michael and myself, a sort of a group. And there was also then Louis Carlyle when we were looking for a female voice. There was a Mr. Leahy there, about 1953, he gave us a little electric motor that he had made himself, wound and everything else, and we're fascinated with this because with a little battery. Of course you didn't do anything with the motor, but it was fascinating to get it. But the other thing he gave us was a crystal set. Now this was absolutely a godsend to us, because that's roughly what a crystal set looked at. This was one he had made himself, and you can see here there was all sorts of, you could buy kits for making them. And the idea of a crystal set, I don't know if any of you remember, but a crystal set worked. There was a certain crystal, and somewhere along the coil here, you would be able to log on to the local station, which was Radio Erin. And there was no electricity. The signal itself was strong enough to motivate this crystal. But what you did need was, you needed a very good set of earphones. Having got this crystal set, we discovered that you could use the earphones as a microphone. By stringing a piece of wire between them, you know, one person there, you could hear what they were saying on wire. So we set up this Linden Lea Broadcasting Union, and we started writing short plays, typing them up for 3 or 4 or 5 people. And we'd go into one of our neighbours' houses, and we would put a wire into the back of the radio, and go into another room with a piece of wire, and we would go and give this little play, and then our neighbours could listen to it on the radio. When we needed a female voice, we got Louis in. Then we started experimenting with this earphones, you know, where you could speak to one another. So we came up with another system, and this was rather ingenious in that if you had 2 wires from one earphone to the other, you could talk to another. So we decided we were going to connect the houses together. Electric cable was quite expensive then, so we bought these old transformer coils and uncoiled the wire. It was copper wire, heavy duty, and as long as the wires didn't touch, as long as you had the 2 wires separated, the signal would be carried. So what we did was, we put the wires down along the wall here, then we went across the road, up the thing here, you can see it there, look, across, and there we were, up there, across, up along here, in through Des Arrigo's house, which was there, down to the backfield, up along the wall of the backfield, up to Charlie Byrne's house. And we were able to talk to one another. The reason we were able to put up with the road, I forgot to tell you, was the joint in the centre had never been tarred. You know, normally they put tar in it. To this day, there still is no tar there. And I reckon the wire that we put down underneath the road, which was proper cable, electricity cable, I bet you it's still there. So we had then a protocol for getting in touch with one another. In 1955, Mr. Carlyle, family were all involved in the electrical business. He knew a person selling a Webster wire recorder. There's a Webster wire recorder. At that time, tape recorders didn't exist, and there was no way for recording your voice and hearing it back. Well, Radio Erin not were able to do it, but in a household situation, it was impossible. we got the chance of buying this Webster wire recorder, and we paid the large sum of £10 for it, £2.50 each. In hindsight, I reckon that the person that sold it was looking for a good home, not to make any money, because as you can see there, it was around $250 to buy one of them at the time in the States. They all came from the States. And basically what they had was a thing here with wire on it, and that was loaded on there, and it went from there to this spool, and as it went through it recorded your voice. And then you rewound it and then recorded it over again. Now this was a godsend to us then, because we were able to put on better plays, bring this into people's houses and let them hear. But where we got fantastic enjoyment was people visiting us, because sometimes we would record them unknown to themselves and then play it back. And this was the first time that most people ever heard their own voice. Hard to believe that there was no way of listening to your own voice. At the end of this, Charlie Byrne actually went on into sound, and he ended up as the head of sound in RTE, broadcasting the television. Another little job we had in 1955, Michael and myself, we started doing a round with the milkman. He'd call about 5:30 or 6 in the morning. This was during the summertime, and we'd go up all the houses around here. A Merville estate had been built at that stage, and that was the milkman's run. It was absolutely a joy to go into Merville, because what we were allowed to do was we were allowed to drive this van from the top of Merville down to the main road. And of course, you see, from the milkman's point of view, he was able to do his deliveries in about half the time. So he gained and we gained, but the joy of driving the milk float was absolutely fantastic for like an 8 or 9 year old child. I don't know what the police and that would think of that nowadays. In 1954 we got our first record player, and there was a dance set, and they played the 12-inch, no, the 78, there we are, 78 records. So we're making days of Bakelite, and we used to go into tickets in the end of Grafton Street to buy the records. And of course, I don't know if any of you remember going in there, but they used to have about 3 or 4 booths. Buying a record was a big deal, because you go in and you'd ask for a record, and you go and listen to it, and then you'd ask another one. Like you spent a while choosing it, because there were 5 and 9pence for a record, so they weren't exactly cheap. So you made sure you got what you wanted. We spent many hours listening to records, and we had it set up in our bedroom at home. And the great thing was, I think it would take 10 records at a time. There's a spindle there, and you could play the records. And if you wanted to play it over and over again, you just left the spindle up, and it would just keep going. And at some later stage, long players were available. Some later years, what we call extended play came along, which was then the standard record for many, many years, the 45. The thing about the radio in those days was, it was imperative that you listen to Radio Luxembourg. And Radio Luxembourg used, at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, used to play the top 20. So you've got a bit older, without knowing what happened to the top 20, so you had to stay up there. And the other thing was that all the records, if you might notice nowadays, if you listen to these old records, none of them were ever longer than 3 minutes. And the reason for that was very, very simple. That Radio Luxembourg wanted to play 20 records, top 20, and they had to play them in the hour with 1 or 2 ad breaks. So the maximum time for any record was 3 minutes. And that's where that 3-minute record came from. Nowadays, of course, they go on for long periods, but it was just a little item that people may not be aware of, was why they were all so short, those records in those days. And I'm just going to finish here with the zoo. And in those days, you could literally get a ride on the elephant's back. And they also had a Pony Express, the little thing. And they used to go all around the zoo, and really enjoyed that. And it was a day out. But the other item then, of course, was for a penny, the elephant keeper would give you a little tray full of bread, and then you could feed that to the elephant. When the tray was empty, the elephant used to take the tray in the snout, pick it up and hand it back to the zookeeper. And with that, I'll say they are my recollections of growing up in 1950s in Stillorgan.
Now, before I hand it over to questions, I have two very quick questions, Don, to ask you. One, you talked an awful lot of little bit of ill discipline. What happened? What was discipline like in the schools?
Very rough. We used to have about an hour and a half of Irish in the morning, then we had some and English. Sometimes we'd have singing, sometimes a little bit of history. But if in those days, if you didn't know your lessons, you got biffed with a leather strap. That was it. So there was no mercy shown to anyone, and that was the rule of the law then.
And food, I'm conscious that I come from a small little town in the country, and there used to be country boys come in with their lunches and we went home for lunches. What was the situation? Because the school was spread over 3 different sites.
Yeah, well, we used to just bring sandwiches and milk to school. I can remember, I don't know if anyone ever remembers the milk and magnesia bottles, the blue ones. Really strong bottles. That's what we took the milk in.
Great. Okay.
That was our sustenance.
Will be done. Any questions?
Is there any sign of the stream still around? I don't know where it is around.
That river is totally culverted now. The one thing which we used to like doing in those days was where the Orchard pub is now, it's Cullins in those days. We used to go down there and we used to walk under the main road in the culvert. The other thing is that end of the river was full of briars, maybe 6, 10, 12 feet wide. And we used to cut out these and make little huts in them. We used to play in the water too, and never heard of Wild's disease or any of these other things that rats have, but obviously we survived them all. But it was a great playground at the river at the time.
Okay. Another question here, Don.
I had an aunt, Miss O'Donnell, taught in Kilmacud school in the late 50s with John Ballard.
Can you get that, Mike?
I had an aunt taught in Kilmacud school, Miss O'Donnell.
Miss O'Donnell. I had her.
She's my aunt, yeah.
In first and second class.
She was there a long time, and then she went to the model school.
What was the name of the river, Don?
Well, it's now known as the Kilmacud stream, but I'm not sure whether that was the original name, or did it even have a name?
Thank you very much. It's been really fascinating because I grew up and we both grew up here in Stillorgan. But I'm intrigued about the grotto. I can't quite place where it is. Is it somewhere within St. John of God's or?
No,
where
it was
exactly?
Between the bypass, which was the old bypass over there, and that was all just rough ground. There was no fencing or anything there. We had to cycle along the whole of that.
But the picture you have shows some, it looks like it's a fairly complete ruin, for want of a better word.
Is
it still around?
It was built out of brick. Somebody here would have a bit more knowledge.
As part of the culture thing, we organised a visit to the grotto this year. We had about 35 people, including yourself, Don.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating thing. So, you know, if the interest was there, we might ask the gentleman to do it sometime next year. It's owned privately. And
the houses were built around it, and that's why we were able to make these platforms there, because the builder was storing his timber in there. But of course, we didn't even know what it was in that day. It was just a playground to us.
I was just interested to know whether you had around this area, because I'm only a blow in 38 years, but anyway. Did you have what we used to call the pig man or the skin man?
Oh yes.
Calling.
Yeah. With the slops.
Yeah, because he was the original recycling man, or the composter. It all went to the pigs.
And he
wore a
left at the back door,
yeah.
and he called around about twice a week to pick that up. That was I'd forgotten all about that.
Yeah, he used to wear a brown coat with twine around it for a belt. And, yeah. Thank you.
When you were talking about the various shops that used to be there before the shopping centre, I was just wondering, do you remember the abattoir? Because when we were very small children, occasionally some poor animal would escape from the abattoir and run riot up around
Probably missed
Stillorgan.
that when I was going through there. Where the, yeah, I missed that bit, but I should have told you. When we were in the school in the old library on a Wednesday, the stink was unbelievable there. Because the abattoir, the butcher used to kill the animals right behind it. And when we were coming home from school, we used to go up there and watch it going on, and the blood used to come down to the abattoir. And we thought it was normal.
No, in fact, that last exchange has just confirmed it, because I did the same circuit from the barn at the top of Mount Marion down to the public library, the classrooms above the town hall. And my children had never believed to me that my classrooms were above an abattoir. So I recall that, but I just wondered if you
Well, they actually weren't above it, because the abattoir was actually behind it. And there was the school, there was the hall was there as well.
That's what I was going to ask you about. And the library was downstairs. There was a public library.
No, the hall was at the back, and the public. The library was actually at ground level.
Yes, and so the library too had a fire that we used to. We could take out books in the evening. My recollection is it was a kind of limited number of hours that it.
Oh,
that it
room,
remained
yeah.
open.
And the little, the books were in little cases, or the shelves. They had a bit of metal in front of them, so you couldn't actually take the books out.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to add to that, the abattoir was at the back. It was smelly, and on its left, as you look towards the abattoir, was St. Lawrence's Hall, which was a hall, and in the hall it housed the bookcases with some very old books in them. Well, not very old, but very grotty books. and that's the way it stayed. It was only open, I think, Saturday mornings, maybe 2 nights a week.
That's right. That was the library. Actually, that was at the front of the building. That's where we
Yeah.
were. That's where we had a classroom in that room.
Yeah.
And the hall then was at the back.
Yeah.
The big hall at the back. But it was all the one bit.
It's all one room, basically.
Yeah, well, the hall was at the back of it. Yeah.
Could I remind you that there was a bootmaker shop at the bottom of the hill, beside where the orchard is now. It was owned by the Licken family. Did you remember them?
I don't remember, because I probably never got shoes there. My memory of shoes was always going into Bradley's in Nassau Street. And that was an amazing place, because they had this, it was sort of an x-ray machine. You put your feet in and you could actually see the bones in your feet. And then when you were getting into a pair of shoes, you then went in again to make sure there was room between your toes and the shoe. And Bradley's, my memory of Bradley's was they had a rocking horse, and when you were leaving they gave you a balloon. So that was a favourite place for children's shoes.
Another question here, Don, yeah.
Hello, you can hear me okay? I go back a bit further than you do, Don. I lived in Stillorgan from 1940 to 1957. I just pick it up on Lickens. The thing I remember about Lickens is that John Charles McQuaid used to parade through the village in his limousine every day. But occasionally he would stop at Lickens, and Lickens made his shoes.
Right.
So that was the kind of claim to fame there. But also going back to the thing about the school, I went to the school beside the little church, which is now, I think it sells vegetables or something. And Mrs. Dowdle, she took infants first, second and third.
And the babies.
And babies,
Yeah.
and I went through all of that. And then I went into the next room, and I went into 4th class. And there was 4th, 5th and 6th, and there was a Mr. Gorman. And Mr. Gorman was a long, tall man, not in the best of health a lot of the time. And he'd be missing every now and then, and he had a brother who was about half his size, and they were looked like mutton jack. and Jeff would come in every now and then and take all of the class. And it was an absolutely hopeless school. I mean, there were no leathers, very little in the way of leathers or sticks or anything like that. Anyway, by the end of 4th class, I could hardly write my name in Irish. And the parents had enough of it, and they pitched me off down to the Christian Brothers of Dunleary. And that was a big culture shock. Things really opened up there. But I also remember the cinema being opened, and that was a great cinema because it had a great curve on it so that everybody could see. And I remember I went to the movies the very first night it opened, and I can still remember the movie. It was called The Black Knight, and it had Adam Ladd and Patricia Medina. And it was great. But when I lived in a house which was demolished to make way for the shopping centre, and for most of my life there was the far side of the road was a big 8-foot granite wall, and behind it there was Morrow's farm, right? But that was demolished, and of course we got shops, and we got a bowling alley. And Stillorgan completely changed. I mean, you could have arrived in a helicopter, you wouldn't know whether you were in Texas or Dublin, you know. It was unbelievable. But, you know, it was just, it was a really totally different place, like, in that time. But I can remember too, for instance, go back to the war days, and I can remember seeing my first orange, which was an extraordinary thing. I can still visualise that. It was amazing to see an orange, you know.
Don, I've been wondering, I looked at your go-karts and I remember seeing them as children myself, and as a child myself. What did you use for brakes?
Well, I tell you, to wear a perfunctory thing, we used to put a piece of wood into the side, so if you pulled it, it should actually slow one of the wheels down. It was never the object to go slow.
Quick question, Don. I think I'm of similar vintage. I also got a Baco set in about 1951 or 52, and you built your own little houses. But my elder brother got what was called a Meccano set. Did you ever encounter that? Do you have any memories of that at all?
Meccano wasn't up to the same standard as the Baco, actually doing nice little houses and that.
I know, but you could do great engineering. You did a different thing. That was great. Thank you.
Dom, I'm just wondering, were Blackrock bats in operation when you were young? Because I remember in the 60s, from the other side of town.
My memories of Blackrock bats was when I moved out to Clontarf. We used to cycle from Clontarf with a big gang of people meet along the way, and we used to cycle out to Blackrock Baths and spend a half a day there. But when I was living here, it was Sea Point was the place we all went to, and you had to pay into Blackrock Baths. That's true.
Anybody else before we finish? Okay, can I thank Don very sincerely? I think, despite